My name is Saul, S-A-U-L, Nova, N-O-V-A. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts on May 24th, 1924.
How did you happen to wind up in World War II?
Well, thanks to Adolf Hitler and Tojo, we found ourselves at war on December 7th, 1941. I was 17 and a half years old at that time. It was in New York, as I recall. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I think. Now you'll have to bear with me because my memory isn't that good anymore. We were playing basketball at a playground, PS-20 playground, had a chain link fence around a concrete yard, and the basketball court was a half court. It wasn't a full court. We used to play a three men on each team. And on a weekend, there would always be a line of guys sitting along the chain link fence waiting to get into the game. And I remember, the team that scored 20 points got to stay on the court, and then three new guys first in line along the fence. And if you won 3 games in a row, everybody got off the court. And most of the people that got off the court went back and got at the back end of the line along the chain link fence. And then there was what we call a candy store across the street, sold tobacco and candy and stuff like that. And somebody yelled that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, and we didn't know what the heck they were talking about. None of us knew where Pearl Harbor was. And eventually we figured out, somebody said, it's in Hawaii, it's a naval base. Well, of course, we knew with that news that we were at war. So, and as I recall, I'm talking about guys that were between 17 and 19 years of age that used to hang around the basketball court playing. Must have been about 50 guys. I think every one of them volunteered to go into the service. There was one fellow that was rejected, had a heart condition. But I've always been proud of that.
So you went in right away then after Pearl Harbor?
Well, actually, I don't remember. My friend tells me, I was trying to remember why I decided to volunteer for the aviation cadet program. And I couldn't quite remember why, but a friend of mine who was eventually became a navigator on a B-24 bomber, he said we had seen a movie about flying, and that's why he and I decided to volunteer for the aviation cadet program. Of course, you had to be 18 years old. So we waited until we weren't actually called until, well, we took a physical exam, pretty tough physical exam, and then there was a written exam that if you passed both, then you were qualified to get into that program. I had gone to Stuyvesant High School. I graduated when I was 17, and they had a scientific program. So the questions that were asked were all stuff that I had studied in high school. Yeah. So, but anyway, I don't recall, but I got it was later in '42 when after my 18th birthday, that I was called into the service. And I was sent to Atlantic City for basic training, which sounds like you're going on vacation, but believe me, in the wintertime, Atlantic City is not a vacation. They had converted a lot of the hotels to barracks, and we took all of the standard basic training that people going into the Army do. And I remember we marched up and down the boardwalk in January, with that wind coming in off the ocean, man, it was freezing cold, freezing cold. And the other thing I remember about it is that the floors, all the carpeting had been pulled up in the hotels, and they had linoleum carpeting, and the Army shoes left black marks on the linoleum. And twice a week, they'd wake us up about 2 o'clock in the morning, and we'd go out in the halls and scrub the floors, clean, get rid of all those black marks. So that was part of our basic training. I don't think I ever scrubbed the floor after I got out of the service after that. And then I don't remember, I guess that was probably a couple of months or so, and then they sent me to Syracuse University, and I was there. It was either 6 months or 8 months, I don't know, but they claim that we had 2 years worth of college credits in that period of time. And I'm not surprised, because it was pretty much a 24/7 operation. You know, you had very little time off. You were going from early morning until late at night. You were either in the classroom or you were out doing some kind of physical exercise of one type or another. So by the time you left there, you were in pretty good shape.
Where'd you go from there?
They finally assigned me to what they called Class 44E. That designated the year and the month. If you gave an alphabet letter to every month, that would have come to May of 44. If you made it through the program, you would graduate in May of 44, which is Class 44E. I went to San Antonio, Texas for pre-flight. They called that pre-flight. And it was pretty much the same thing that had happened at Syracuse University. It was all classroom work and physical work, physical exercise. But it was during that period, I think I was there a couple of months, and it was during that period of time that the government decided which training program you'd go into. You'd go into pilot program or navigator or bombardier, and if you didn't go into one of those three, you could elect to go back into the Army or to aerial gunnery or whatever. And they did ask you what your preference was, but there was no guarantee that you would get that. I asked for pilot training. I was lucky to be assigned to that. So the pilot training program, Cuero, Texas, was the first, was called a primary training school, which lasted a couple of months. And I had never been in an airplane. And we flew a PT-19 made by Fairchild, which was an open cockpit, one cockpit behind the other. And the instructors were all civilians. A fellow named Gormley, I remember, I'm surprised I remember his name. Big, tall Texan. He had, I guess, about 5 or 6 students. I don't remember exactly, but I do remember the very first time he took me up. I sat in the back cockpit, open cockpit, with a parachute, and he strapped me in as tight as a matter of fact, I complained it was too tight, and he said, "No, it's not," and I kept my mouth shut. And we got up. I remember vividly the first time we took off, and I started looking around, and it was overwhelming experience. First time ever been in an airplane. And we got up to about 2,000 feet, and he turned the plane upside down. And there I was, hanging out there, looking down at the ground. I don't know how long we were upside down, but it seemed like a long time. And then he righted the plane, and we came around and landed. And what I found out was that all of the civilian instructors did that. They received a bonus for every student that graduated primary training. So they wanted to find out if you'd get airsick. And so that's what they did. And you'd come down, and every once in a while you'd see a plane come down, and they were cleaning out the back cockpit. So everybody that became airsick was washed out immediately. As soon as they found out you got sick, you were out of the program. And those people, I guess, because they did get sick, probably were not allowed to move into any kind of occupation that would require flying. Because, you know, even if you're a navigator or a bombardier, you're still up in the air, or an aerial gunner. So I don't know exactly what happened to them. They probably went back into the Army. So, but anyway, before you could graduate from primary training, they did have Army pilots, Army Air Corps pilots, that gave you a final flight test. I soloed, perhaps after about 7 hours of instruction, which was fairly typical, I think. I don't know exactly what the average was. But one day we landed, and he turned to me, he says, "Okay, take it up." So it was a thrilling moment. All I did was circle the field and come in and land. And so anyway, when at the end of the 2-month period, before you could go on to the next stage of training, you had to be checked out by an Army pilot, an Air Corps pilot, and which obviously I passed the test. I do remember that there was a handle on the left side of the plane that if you pulled it, and it was pretty quiet, when you pulled it shut, you could not use the controls. You couldn't make the plane turn or bank or anything. When you make your landing, the base leg is when if the runway is here, your base leg is in this direction, and you're going to turn into the landing area. At that point, he had locked the controls. And when I tried to turn, nothing happened. But I figured it out pretty quickly and unlocked them, which I think probably got me a passing grade, because I reacted pretty quickly. So leaving Cuero, I went to Waco, Texas for basic training in a BT-13 made by, I think, Beechcraft. And these had cockpits, dual cockpits behind each other, but they had covers on them. They had sliding covers, glass covers, and continued the training. All of the training was a combination of flying, so much flying, classroom work. There was always a lot of classroom work, and physical training. So it was a combination of all three. But you more or less advanced into a more complicated flying training. That lasted a couple of months, and then from there I went to Moore Field in McAllen, Texas, which is on the Mexican border, and flew AT-6s, which was a slightly more advanced plane than the. That's where I learned how to fly in formation, because fighters are always in formation. And graduated in May of '44, just as scheduled. They did ask where we would prefer which theater of operation we would prefer to serve in. And since the war in Europe looked like it was winding down, most of the guys asked to serve in the Pacific. And so that's where I eventually wound up. But, and they did also ask you whether you wanted to go into fighters, fly fighters or fly bombers. I asked for fighters, and I was lucky every time. I got pretty much what I asked for. So after a short furlough home, I was sent to California. And the first fighter that I flew was a P-39, a Bell Air Cobra, which was no longer being used in combat. It was a kind of an unstable plane. But I spent a short period of time in San Bernardino, California, with P-39s. And then I was sent to Lemoore Field, which was mostly classroom work. I was waiting to be assigned to a P-38 flight training program. While at Lemoore Field, I met a girl that I eventually married. It was at in those days, the bands would travel around and they'd set up in a local gym and have a Friday night or a Saturday night dance. And so I had a blind date, 4 of us that had a blind date to this dance in Visalia. And this one girl was just my date, but there was another girl that I liked better. So before the night was over, we had switched partners, and she became my wife. We were married close to 58 years. She passed away in '02. And I miss her to this day. But I was then sent to Chico, California, which is about 100 miles north of Sacramento, at an air base. They had a P-38 training program. I was there I guess maybe 6 months or so. And that's where you learned how to fly. It was a highly intensive program, and I learned everything I needed to learn. And the only thing I can report that sticks in my mind about that program, other than the fact that I was that's where I was married. My wife-to-be came to Chico. We were married in Chico in January of '45. We used to practice aerial combat, and I learned my favorite maneuver for getting somebody off my tail was something called a split S. If you look at the shape of the letter S and cut it in half, that's half an S. It was called a split S. And a split S is simply, if you're flying along, you turn the plane upside down and you just die like that. Well, fighter planes learn how to chase other fighter planes. It's hard to get rid of a guy that's a good pilot who's on your tail. He's going to go wherever you go. And it's pretty hard to shake him. But if you do a split S, I had calculated it would take a little over, and this is not perfect, I'm just trying to remember. If you calculated about 2,000 feet to do a split S, you'd lose about 2,000 feet of altitude. So if you got down to about 2,300 feet and you did the split S, they wouldn't follow you. It was too close to the ground. But I had been practicing it, and I knew pretty much how much to allow for. As a matter of fact, the commanding officer of the squadron that was of the training program reprimanded me for cutting it that close, but I assured him that it worked every time, and he found out that it did. So that's how I got away. I learned to get away from the guys on my tail. But at any rate, I was there for about 6 months. I don't remember exactly. But I did, I think I left to go overseas in March of 45. I think it was March of 4, something like that. And I went to New Guinea, to Nadzab, New Guinea. The war in New Guinea was over. The Japanese had been conquered by the Australians with the help of the United States Air Force. At that time, the Army Air Corps, and I flew what was called a mission while down there, but basically we flew from Nadzab to Biak, an island called Biak, which is part of Indonesia, and in the interim strafed some Japanese that were in Wewak, New Guinea, on the beach. It was a fairly wide beach, and the Japanese never surrendered. They were a very determined enemy. They were on the island, on the beach, fishing for food. They were probably part of a number of Japanese who would either didn't know the war in New Guinea was over, or they just refused to surrender, whatever. But they were holed up in this isolated part of the jungle, and we strafed them. I don't know if I hit anybody or not. I just shot my guns, but I couldn't tell. And then we flew on to Biak and landed there, stayed there overnight. Matter of fact, we stayed there 2 nights and then flew back to Nadzab. What I remember about Biak is I went swimming. They had beautiful beaches. And I had never seen any coral plants before. And going down under the water, which I like to do, I saw these incredible plants down there in these beautiful colors. And I swam over and put my hand on it without realizing that they weren't really plants. And I wound up with my right hand was covered with splinters just by slightly touching them. And I went to see the doctor, who wasn't there at the time I arrived. The technician was there, and he was trying to pick these splinters out of my hand, and the doctor walked in, and he walked over, he says, "What the devil are you doing? You can't," he says to me, "those splinters will work their way into your hand and come out through your bloodstream." He put some salve on it and put a bandage around it. He says, "Don't worry about it. In a week or so, it'll be gone." And he was right. But so I was lucky that he walked in when he did, because I just sat there and this guy's trying to dig one splinter at a time out of my hand. But I think I joined my fighter squadron in, I think it must have been April or May of 45. They were based in the Philippines at the time, in Mindoro, Philippines. And the war in the Philippines was just about over. They were waiting for a new assignment. And the new assignment eventually came to move the squadron up to Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1st of 45 and lasted close to 3 months, which is probably one of the bloodiest battles of the war in the Pacific. I've read about it, and there were, I think, about 300,000 Japanese casualties, about half of them civilian. And one of the most interesting parts of that battle, which are an example of how resilient the Japanese were, is the Marines and the soldiers, the Army, reported that when a Japanese soldier was shot and fell to the ground, there were instances when the women would pick up the rifles and continue the battle. The civilian women would continue the battle. So that's always remained with me, that information. The other thing that was interesting is I go to a senior citizen classes at DU. And just a few months ago, I was at a class, and this fellow was sitting next to me, and he looked like he was older than me. And I don't remember if he asked me first or if I asked him. We found that we were both World War II vets. And he said, "Oh, I was an engineer. And I was in charge of an engineering outfit. And the last job we had was lengthening the runways on Aishima, which is a little island off the coast of Okinawa, so that the P-38s could land." So I said, "That's strange, because we were sitting in the Philippines waiting for you to finish." You never know who you're going to run into, you know. So we moved to Aishima at the beginning of July of 45. And we knew, based upon the battle in Okinawa and the losses, the Navy sustained more losses in the Battle of Okinawa. I think they lost about 38 ships were sunk by kamikazes, and about another 250 ships were damaged, because it's only about 400 miles from Japan. So the kamikazes were flying down from Japan. We knew, and I guess Washington knew, that the invasion of Japan was going to be a very tough and a very bloody affair, based on what had happened in Okinawa. So at any rate, but when we made the move, I had a life-altering experience, because we had, the other thing that happened is the squadron carried about 40 pilots, but they beefed it up to 50. So that was in preparation for the invasion. And we had about 27 planes, which was the most the squadron had ever had. But being junior, since having just joined the squadron, I didn't get to fly one of the planes up to Aishima. I went on an LST. An LST was a ship, had a flat bottom, and it was a ship that went up onto the beach, and the entire front end of the ship would fold down, and all the heavy equipment that was in the hold would drive off the ship right onto the beach. What happened was, on the trip on this LST, of course, being wartime at night, everything was, all the windows, the portholes were blacked up and blacked out, and no lights emanating from the ship in case there were any submarines around. But I went down below decks into an area where they had hammocks. There were about 3 high, where you slept in these hammocks. And coming down the stairwell, I noticed some army cots off to the side that were folded up in a stack of army cots, folding cots. Anyway, I got into the middle hammock, and I couldn't fall asleep. It was so close in there, and it was so heavy. I just felt like I was choking. I couldn't breathe. It was so and I think part of it was that I remembered seeing those cots. So I thought, oh, I'm going to get up and get one of those cots and go up on deck, which I did. It was about 2 in the morning. And I got up out of the hammock and walked over, got a cot, walked up to the bridge part of the ship, or where the part where they drive the ship. And I set the cot up outside the bridge. Nobody knew I was there. And lay down, and boy, I must have fallen asleep like that. And during the evening, they hit heavy seas, and that ship started rocking back and forth. And my cot slid down to the railing pretty quickly. And when it hit the railing, it flipped me. And as I was going overboard, the top rail, caught in my left armpit. And I think that when the cot hit the rail, that probably woke me up. But I knew instantly where I was, and I grabbed my shirt. Hold on, I held on to the shirt. And, so I was dangling over the end, and I'm like, and when the ship rocked this way, I was further out. But when it rocked the other way, it helped me to climb back on board. I grabbed the rail with my right hand and then the left hand and climbed back on board. So obviously, I took the cot and went back to the hammock. But that, that kind of changed me. And I thought, what happens, happens. It was, became a fatalist or whatever. Just whatever's going to happen, happen. I never really worried much about anything. I always have a fair amount of confidence in myself. But that, really, I've never forgotten that for obvious reasons. So. But anyway, we landed at Aishima. And the missions were, I learned later that the invasion was planned for November. And I think they were planning to land at 3 different places on Kyushu. Kyushu is the southernmost part of the main islands of Japan. They were going to land on the southern tip and then about 100 miles up the coast on the Pacific side and 100 miles up the coast on the East China Sea side of Kyushu. There was a Japanese air base located on the very tip of Kyushu, and the plan would have been to capture that air base, and when they captured that air base, we would move the squadron from Aishima up to that air base. So in preparation for the invasion, there were B-29s that were flying in from different places that were bombing Japan. Our job was more or less skip bombing missions. Skip bombing is, if you've ever thrown a rock across the water, it skips. There are no suspension bridges in Japan. All the bridges are built on foundations. And the only way you can destroy a bridge like that is to hit the foundation from the side, which requires trying to skip a bomb off the water into the side of the foundation.
You've flew an awful lot of missions. You talk about shooting down planes. Did you shoot down?
No, I never engaged in any aerial combat. The Japanese, at that point, were conserving everything they had. They knew the invasion was coming. So never saw an enemy plane in the air.
Just what was it like flying a P-38?
Well, to this day, there's a controversy over which was the best fighter in World War II, P-38 or the T-51. I flew both planes. I preferred the 38. As a matter of fact, all the pilots that I know that flew both planes would say the same thing. They preferred the P-38. There were specific reasons. There is something in physics known as torque, T-O-R-Q-U-E. Everybody has experienced torque. If you've ever ridden in a car and you say you're a passenger and the driver makes a turn to the right and you find your body moving to the left, that's torque. Well, in a propeller-driven aircraft, if you have the propeller turning, say, to the right, it tends to throw the plane to the left. So that needs correction. And the way you correct that manually would be to keep the rudder pedal in to counteract that torque. Well, a pilot can't fly with that rudder in. He's got other things to do. So you use your trim tabs. On the rudder itself, there's a little part of the rudder that also moves, and those are called trim tabs. So it's used to keep that rudder positioned to counteract the torque. Now, why is torque important? It's not just that it makes it more difficult to fly, but it also affects your ability to hit a target. Because when the bullets leave the guns, there is also the same tendency for them to veer to the left. So if you aren't aerodynamically in a perfect aerodynamic condition, you have to counteract that torque on the bullets themselves. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is that on all single-engine fighters, the guns were mounted under the wings. The guns are mounted under the wings, 4 50 caliber machine guns under each wing, and the bullets converge at 800 feet in front of the plane. Well, there are no instruments to tell you when you're at 800 feet. You have to eyeball it. And the only way I can explain eyeballing 800 feet is if you ever went to a Rockies game at Coors Field, if a guy hits a home run over the fence, it's 400 feet. Well, 800 feet is twice as far. So you have to eyeball 800 feet. Well, what happens if you're 1,000 feet, the bullets are going to meet at 800 feet, and then they're going to go that way. So you're going to miss the target. In a P-38, the bullets were in the nose. You had 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20 millimeter cannon in the nose, straight ahead. And you could hit a target at 1,800 feet that way. And the other thing is that because you had 2 propellers, they rotated in opposite directions. So there was no torque. See? Those are the 2 major differences between the 2 planes. And that is why I think it was the best plane we had. But you get married to certain planes, so I'm sure that if you had a P-51 pilot sitting in this chair, he'd give you a lot of reasons why I'm wrong.
But it had to be a pretty versatile plane because you mentioned doing the skip bombing and strafing and ground attack and things like that as well.
It was a very versatile plane. It could do a lot of damage on the ground, tremendous amount of damage. We carried 2 500-pound bombs on skip bombing, one bomb under each wing. And of course, when you in a skip bombing run, you tried the best you could to get down on the surface of the river and hit that river and hopefully at the right moment skip those bombs into the side of the bridge. But those you could do a lot of damage with those bombs. And so it also performed fairly well at high altitudes. It had a very long range. But if you were on a long range flight, I was on a number of missions that were about 8 hours in duration. You get back, you're pretty tired. You're in formation all that time as well, so you're pretty tired by the time you get back. But in those types of missions, you instead of bombs, you carried fuel tanks, and you could carry the P-38 consumed about 2 gallons a minute. So if you had each drop tank had about 330 gallons, that was an extra 660 gallons. So you'd have, say close to over 1,100 gallons. So let's say 1,200 gallons, make it even. So that's what, 600 minutes divided by 6, So but it wasn't quite that long. It must have been closer to 1,100 gallons or something like that. So.
You mentioned even though you didn't do any aerial combat and the Japanese were holding their planes back, with the P-38 you probably felt like you could perform well against anything the Japanese had at that time.
No question. The guys, there's a tremendous amount of confidence. The Americans put more into safety for its pilots. I remember we had a steel cockpit seat that made of steel, and it had a high back. It was over my head. So if anybody shot at you from behind, they couldn't hit you. If they hit your seat, they'd hit that steel, which was pretty thick. And I lost an engine on a mission over Japan, and I was probably about 500 miles from Aishima at the time. And the squadron went on ahead, and one guy hung back with me in case I didn't make it. And but I got back safely. I landed with one engine. The funny thing about it was that the moment I touched down, the one engine that was working burst into flames. So, but they knew I was coming in. So the people that combat those sort of things, the ground safety people, were already waiting for me. But I pulled off the runway and stopped, and I got the hell out of there and started running. So, the other thing I could tell you, when I finally got my own plane, every pilot got their own plane. And we had this artist in our squadron. I named my plane after my wife. Her name was Pansy May, M-A-E. And he painted a picture of her on the nose, Pansy May, and it looked beautiful. And I never got a photograph of that plane because a friend of mine, and I won't tell you his name, his plane he was going on a mission. His plane was in servicing, being serviced, maintenance. So he used mine, and he lost an engine on takeoff. And the runway off of Aishima, the minute, if you took off to the northeast, the moment you left the runway, you were over the ocean. So that plane is sitting at the bottom of the ocean about 500 feet down. To this day, it's still sitting there. They know it's there, but who the heck's going to get it at 500 feet? he managed to get out. He claimed he finally got the canopy open. The canopy opened this way. And got out of the plane. He estimates he was about 100, but I don't think he was that far. He couldn't have made it if he was that deep. No, he probably got out a lot faster than that. And they always stationed a boat at the end of the runway just in case something like that happened. So he was picked up pretty quickly.
It probably seemed like it was that deep.
The only thing I can remember when I lost that engine, going back, I was debating with myself if I should lose the other engine, I would have to make a decision. Am I going to ditch or am I going to bail out? And the problem with ditching is a pretty treacherous procedure unless you have a very calm sea. And you can't tell what the ocean is like until you get low enough. Well, by that time, it's too late to change your mind. So I would probably bail out. The best way to bail out of a P-38 is to turn it upside down and drop out. Because there were people, in cases where people got caught on the tail section. The other thing they told you is that there were cases where they said if you bail out over water, you want to loosen the straps around your thighs before you get into the water so that you can slip out of the parachute and not get tangled up in it. Well, when you're over water, it's almost impossible to tell how high you are. And there were cases where pilots would slip, and they said, before you hit the water, just put your hands up in the air and slide out of the chute. And there are pilots that slid out of their chute 200 feet from the water. So then they changed the procedure to don't do that until your feet actually touch the water. So that was the standard operating procedure. Luckily, I didn't have to do either one. Well, it was a great plane. I was lucky to be assigned to it. The atomic bomb on Hiroshima was dropped on August 6th, I believe. And the second bomb was dropped on August 9th on Nagasaki. But the Japanese did not surrender until August 15th. So between the 9th and the 15th, there were still combat missions. And the last combat mission of any significance by my squadron was flown on August 9th, between the 6th and 15th. And we lost our commanding officer on that flight. Bob Hockley was a hell of a nice guy. And he was a very handsome man, like movie star handsome man. And there was one thing we had in common. When I joined the squadron, he found out that my wife was pregnant. When I went overseas, she was pregnant with our first child. And his wife was pregnant with their first child also. So we had that in common. His wife gave birth, I think it was in June of 45. She had a daughter, a girl, and he used to carry a photograph in his pocket. And so whenever he'd meet anybody, or especially me, he'd pull out that thing. And he says, "How's your wife doing?" Well, I says, "My wife isn't scheduled until October." But he always, anyway, he got shot down on the mission, August 12th mission, on the skip bombing run, and went into the ocean. The bridge was about a half a mile from the ocean. And interestingly, about, maybe 25 years ago, telephone rang in my home, and I picked up. It's a girl, I think her name was Lisa. calling from Ohio, was his daughter. She had gotten the names and phone numbers of the people in the squadron, and she was calling us. I spent maybe 20 minutes on the phone with her. And I told her, about how he'd carry the photograph. And it was a difficult conversation. So he never got to meet his daughter. She never got to meet her dad. But, and I don't know what's happened. That was the only time I ever talked to her.
In the preparations from Okinawa on, did you ever end up having to escort any bombers, the B-29s, over to Japan?
No, they flew from a different location. We never had any escort service. We did escort when the Japanese finally surrendered on August 15th. They sent a group to Manila to meet with MacArthur in Manila, and our squadron was assigned the job of escorting the Japanese transport that was carrying their delegation from Japan to Aishima. And they landed in Aishima and transferred to an American plane and went the rest of the way to Manila. So we felt that was an honor doing that. We moved, we were the first 38 squadron to occupy Japan, P-38 squadron. And there's a number of things that happened during the occupation, my period in the occupation forces, that ever stayed with me. The first was when we got there, we were at an air base north of Fukuoka, which is the largest city in Japan, and Kyushu. I think today it's over 4 million people. This air base was about 20 miles north of Fukuoka, and it was located, the western part of the base was on the sea straits between, just between Japan and the Korean Peninsula. And the rest of the air base was had a chain link fence about 15 feet high. So an air base is a pretty large piece of ground. When we arrived, that air base was surrounded by thousands and thousands of Japanese people, totally surrounded by thousands. Must have been hundreds of thousands. I don't know how they knew we were coming, but they knew. The P-38 had achieved a certain amount of notoriety among the Japanese people. It was an easily identifiable American airplane. P-38 shot down Japan's #1 and killed Japan's #1 hero, Admiral Yamamoto, who led the raid on Pearl Harbor. The P-38 shot down the plane that carried Yamamoto. The two #1 aces in American history, two P-38s, Dick Bond, shot down 40 planes. A fellow named Tom McGuire shot down 38. So the P-38 was pretty well known by the Japanese. And we landed, they had one runway running east to west, and we landed towards the west. A squadron of fighter planes is 16 planes. They fly in groups of 4. So you have 4 flights of 4 planes each. Somebody devised a way for fighter planes to land to get them down the fastest way possible. And the way it worked is you'd be in a formation of 4 off to the right, and you would come down low over the runway, and then the first plane would peel off, and then the second, and so forth, third. That way all 4 were in the landing pattern very quickly, and you'd be down on the ground very quickly. That was the fastest way. The runway, so flight leader decided to put on a show. We got down pretty low. We couldn't have been more than 50 feet off the runway when we peeled off. After landing, you'd get to the end of the runway, and there was a place to turn off the runway, and get on a taxi strip that would carry you back all the way down the length of the runway to where the planes were parked. That taxi strip was perhaps 60 feet from the fence. So as you taxi down that strip, this enormous crowd of people on the other side of the fence. And as you looked over at them, each section you looked at, they all bowed, which is the Japanese traditional way of respect, welcome and respect. It was, it's just no way to describe the feeling you had from that experience. So that's one. I had an experience which sort of part of nation building, We took a society that was a caste society for centuries. I mean, if you were the military class, ran the country. If you were born into the military class, you had it made. If you were born into the peasant class, you remained in the peasant class for the rest of your life. There was no movement up or down. And we took a society that was that rigid and converted it into a democracy, a very successful democracy, functioning to this day, and a very strong ally. It's a remarkable feat. And I participated in one little part of that. We were based at an armaments plant, what was once an armaments plant. It covered about a half a mile square. It had a brick wall completely around it. It was about 12 feet high. After we landed that day, by the time we got to where we were billeted, it was dark, it was nighttime. I was in a building that was next to the wall, up on the second floor, and I shared a room with two other guys. But that morning, when I got up, I was standing next to my bed, I could see over the wall. And there was a dirt road on the other side of the wall. I'm standing there, it was a bright, sunny day. And I see this guy coming along in a two-wheel wagon. But it doesn't have a horse. It's being pulled by a woman carrying a baby on her back. And this guy's sitting up there, and it's obviously it's his wife, and she's pulling the wagon. She's got the baby on her back. And I said, holy mackerel, I'm not in the United States, that's for sure. So I'm standing there and thinking about it. Then I see a flatbed wagon coming. There's not a thing on it. Flatbed wagon. This guy's got a horse to pull it. He's sitting up there with the little thing. And walking behind the wagon, holding on, was this woman with a baby on her back, and this wagon hasn't got anything on it. I think to myself, boy, what kind of, this is a strange place. So that was the other thing that remained with me. The commanding officer of the base one day decided that he wanted the position of OD, Officer of the Day, to rotate among all the officers on the base. Normally, the people that are in the flight, who are flight personnel, are not part of the management of anything. They just concentrate on flying. But he decided he wanted to give everybody a shot. So one day he published this list, and the day it was my turn, I reported to the MP office. There was only one entrance to this complex. And every day we had hundreds of Japanese who would come onto the base. They worked, they did construction jobs, they worked in the kitchen, etc. And I guess it was a pretty good job. And they would come through this gate, and then they would leave through that same gate. And that day when they were leaving, this one Japanese man had been caught stealing some food. So they brought him into the MP's office. He had on, it was in January, and it was a winter cold day, and he had this heavy wool coat that was almost halfway down to his knees and his legs, and had deep pockets on the inside, and he had stashed some food, and he got caught. And so they brought him to the MP office, and the sergeant who's in charge of the MPs, he calls me aside and he says, in a situation like this, we're supposed to turn him over to the local police. But what I want you to realize is that they're going to beat the crap out of him. Because stealing in Japan is a very serious, and stealing from the Americans is a loss of face. They're going to beat him up severely. And I said, well, I don't want to do that. Do we know why he stole the food? Well, I had a Japanese interpreter. So they asked him, why did you steal this food? And he said, well, you know, I come here every day to work, and while I'm here, you feed me. And then I go home, and I have my wife and 3 children, my parents. They don't have enough to eat. And it got to me, it's driving me crazy. I couldn't take it anymore. Well, so I said, well, I don't want to turn him over to the police. I said, let's take the food away from him and issue a warning that if he does it again, he'll lose his job. Which is what we did. Now, the Japanese interpreter he almost became ballistic. He says, you're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to turn, you're supposed to. I says, well, we're not going to do that this time. The sergeant became nervous, and I said, look, I'll take full responsibility for this, and I will go to see the commanding officer tomorrow morning, tell him what happened. You don't have to worry about it, which is what we did. And the next morning, when I got to the commanding officer's office and walked in, he says to me, he says, you don't have to tell me any. I know all about what happened. It's all over the community. The Japanese interpreter had spread the word throughout the community as to what had happened, and there was a lot of resentment. He says, well, in a situation like this, I have to send a report to Tokyo and let them know what occurred. And I'll let you know when I get a reply. A couple of weeks later, I was notified to report to his office the next morning, which I did. He says, there's somebody from the judge advocate's daughter coming down, and we're going to meet with a Mr., I've forgotten his name, a man in his 80s, who was at one time an assistant ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the United States. He spoke English. We're going to this fellow's home to discuss what happened. Full colonel showed up from Tokyo. And the 3 of us, he says, I went to this fellow's home, beautiful home, took off our shoes, walked in, introduced to this man. And before the colonel could say anything, this man started in on him about what we had done. We had violated our understanding. And he went on and on and on and on. And finally, the colonel says, look, we have something in the United States called justice. And it's justice mixed with mercy and understanding. And this particular set of circumstances required the kind of decision that we made, which would be a just decision for this kind of condition. And the ex-ambassador started ranting again, and the colonel looked him straight in the eye And he said, you're going to have to get used to it, just like that. I was never more proud of my country than at that moment. Now, I have no way of knowing whether Douglas MacArthur was involved in that decision or not. He may very well have been. But it was obvious that this colonel came there knowing in advance what he was going to say. So that's the third thing I remember. And the fourth thing I remember is flying over Nagasaki about 3 months or 4 months after the bomb was dropped. And I couldn't believe the devastation. It was just incredible. And realizing that the bomb we used is like a Model T Ford compared to the bombs that exist today. There's no, in my mind, the most serious problem facing this planet is nuclear weapons and the potential use of nuclear weapons. There's no security with nuclear weapons. Everyone should get rid of it, including the U.S. We should try to get rid of all of them and make sure they're never used. But anyway, I did fly a mission to Shanghai. I think somebody told me that the people in Shanghai, when they saw the P-38s, knew the war was ending. They could recognize it was Americans, and the Japanese did not rise to challenge us. Well, we flew around the city twice, and no Japanese plane rose to challenge us. So I remember that fairly well. And then I was sent home. And my squadron was never deactivated. It's still I was with the 80th Fighter Squadron, called the Headhunters. We had an emblem of a headhunter. We had an artist in our squadron who worked with Walt Disney, and he designed that emblem. And the Headhunters had a glorious record in World War II. It was the first squadron to ever shoot down over 200 planes. And the squadron, as I say, was never deactivated. We have fathers and sons served in the squadron, and now I understand within 6 months or so we're going to have a grandson. So we also have 2 female fighter pilots, and so that's progress. And the squadron is based in South Korea now. They're on full alert because of what's happened. We just had a reunion in Colorado Springs last month, and there were 6. So we have veterans from Korea and Vietnam all the way through, people that are still on active duty. And there were only 6 World War II veterans at the reunion. But I did meet a drone fighter pilot, and I'm not going to talk about it because I think it's classified. But it was very interesting. So I was in the service for about 4 years, and was under difficult conditions in many cases, but I learned a lot, and I think it helped shape the rest of my life dramatically.